Thank you very much. I think we've already seen very clearly that the world is facing challenges at a scale that we've never seen before. And we really therefore need to go on what does this mean in terms of how we respond? What does this mean for implications for our society? So I'd like to briefly cover some of these issues from an ethical dimension. If we look at some of the recent press comments about the issue, we have, for instance, this from the International Institute of Strategic Studies. If climate change goes unchecked, its effects will be catastrophic on the level of nuclear war. Security dimension will come increasingly to the forefront as countries begin to see falls in available resources and economic vitality. Increased stress on their armed forces, greater instability in regions of strategic import, increases in ethnic rivalries, and a widening gap between rich and poor. So climate change is going to aggravate all of those other tensions in our society. It's been hard enough for us to live together on this planet without changes in the whole structure of how we're functioning. As soon as you put stresses at a global level, it's going to aggravate all those other sources of tension if we don't try to address them in some coherent fashion, which is why ethics is so important. Another recent comment: on current trends, humanity will need twice as much energy as it uses today within 35 years. Produce too little energy, said the economists, and there will be price hikes and a financial crash unlike any the world has ever known. You sort of put the brakes on, the economies come to a halt. With possible resource wars, depression, and famine. Produce the wrong sort of energy, i.e. fossil fuel energy, say the climate scientists, and we will have more droughts, floods, rising seas, and worldwide economic disaster with runaway global warming. Of course, the challenge is really, can we avoid doing both at the same time? Which seems probably the more likely scenario at the moment. We are going to be running short of energy sources because the fossil fuels are declining, and therefore we're not discovering enough new resources to meet present needs, not to mean this enormous increase in requirements. So we're already facing a tottering situation without the added complexities of climate change. And as you saw from the earlier presentations in the Stern report, the costs of doing nothing are going to be highly significant. So a global approach is necessary. Climate change can't be separated from the challenges of economic globalization, from energy and resource depletion, from poverty reduction, social imbalances, and insecurity. These are all interrelated issues today. None can be separated from the others. Each one interacts with others in complex ways. So if you think modeling the climate is difficult, try modeling the whole human system as it tries to respond to climate change. But partial solutions are not going to solve these problems that threaten future sustainability. We cannot just deal with one part of the issue without looking at that complex set of issues together. We're all responsible for this. In terms of who's responsible, who's at fault, if you need to point the finger, I don't think anybody can say we haven't made our contribution to the problem. We've all benefited from burning fossil fuels. We've all been involved in land clearing or in land use changes that have produced the food that we are eating today and the other materials we need for our lives. Our responsibility depends on where we live. Country responsibilities are highly different. Those who are in the most developed countries clearly have been more responsible than those in the poorest developing countries. Depends on our lifestyle. What is our footprint on the world? Depends on our consumption patterns. Especially the richer you are, you can probably be certain your impact has been higher than if you were among the poorer segments of the population. And yet at the same time, the poor are the greatest victims of climate change. They've contributed the least to the problem, and they're the ones who are going to pay the highest price. And therefore the ethical responsibility from being somebody who causes, we are liable. So if you look at, in North America particularly, suits for liability. Who's at fault? Who should pay for what has been done? This is the case in which we're looking at issues of global liability for costs, and we already saw again, include loss of your whole culture, your national sovereignty, your national territory. We're looking at levels of damage that go beyond many of the things we could have imagined in previous situations. So the dilemma is fundamentally ethical. Just for example, when we look at CO2 contributions, the 60% of CO2 has come from industrial processes, and therefore all of those who have benefited from the industrial lifestyle of the developed countries are clearly the major contributors to that dimension of the problem. When we look at, say, those who've been involved in land clearing, and of course often this has been the poor struggling to exist, clearing a bit of forest to grow their food, then we suddenly see that the other 40%, so to speak, comes from land use changes partly driven by the growing population of the world itself, of which everybody is responsible, partly by the enormous demand from the north for the products of the south. And so even though we might say this has been coming from South America, from Africa, from Asia in large part, the demand that's produced that change has often come as well from those of us in the rich industrialized countries. We've also seen from the data before how little time we have to act. The question of timing is increasingly important today. We saw about the melting permafrost in the Arctic and the methane that will be released. It's already being measured coming out of lakes in Siberia and so on, so this process is underway. The melting of the Arctic has again already been referred to, and each year the figures for the total melting of the Arctic has been going shorter and shorter. And the positive feedbacks weren't taken into account in the summary of the IPCC because they had not yet been proven. And therefore, these are dimensions that are certainly exaggerating the process much more than we've seen before. And we also saw the problem of the Greenland glaciers flowing. So all of the signs, and it's not simply in the Arctic, the same thing with coral reefs bleaching and dying. And so there's really so little time left to act. The rising sea levels, because not only do we see the melting in the North Arctic, the same thing is happening in the West Antarctic ice sheet near the South Pole. It's also greatly increased its rate of flow into the sea. And some estimates suggest this could begin to add up to 4 millimeters a year of additional sea level rise over those that we've been seeing up until now. So whether we're at the tipping point, close to it, it's still debatable, but clearly we don't have any time to lose in responding to the problem. We've also seen already these projections from the IPCC. But what we know is that these changes are going to bring enormous environmental transformations. Increasing natural disasters, loss of land biodiversity. There's an estimate that we could lose 20 to 50% of the terrestrial biodiversity of the planet. Changes in agricultural conditions. The great agricultural areas of the American Midwest could easily become dust bowls again. And you may suddenly find that central and northern Canada will be the replacement area for those areas. Enormous water shortages. Asia depends so much on that great water tower that is the Himalayas. As the glaciers melt, initially they produce additional flooding. When the glaciers are gone, the rivers that supply India, China, Southeast Asia with water will dry up. And so there are enormous concerns about their future water supplies. China is already trying to dam all the rivers they can within the territories to keep the water from going on further into Asia and to try to maintain their water supplies. And then, of course, in areas with increasing drought, we'll have increasing forest fires. We see more fires already. The fires in Indonesia, in tropical forests that used to be too wet to burn, are now burning. The same thing can happen in the Amazon. And then, of course, the soil erosion that will follow. So we see a whole series of consequences coming along from climate change that will bring other environmental impacts. And, of course, the changes in rainfall. All of those brown areas are areas that will dry out and see increasing drought and water shortages. And the blue areas will see increasing rainfall and possibly flooding. So the human impacts of this, the things that we're responsible for, the things that this process is producing, are damage from weather events, floods, droughts, and cyclones, less winter snowfall, melting glaciers, water shortages in many parts of the world, changing conditions of agriculture, forestry, shifting fish stocks. I recently saw some maps showing that the forests of the southeastern United States, the birch forests, will find their best growing conditions in Nova Scotia, in the central Canada, and your beautiful maple forests that bring all your autumn color will be growing up there in Nunavut land, if the forest can move fast enough to cope with the problem. There was a recent issue of New Scientist magazine that had on its cover, "Goodbye Miami." And the maps inside showed Florida as it would be in 70 years, 80, 90 years, losing half the state.